When was the last time you were alone and didn't try to escape it? Not distracted, not entertained, not waiting for a message, a like, a signal from someone else. Just alone in the full weight of your own presence. Most people can't answer that, because most people have never actually met themselves outside the context of others. Their identity is a reflection, curated through feedback, adjusted through approval, constantly reassembled to stay acceptable. But something changes the moment you stop needing that reflection. And if you stay with this until the end of the video, you'll understand why that kind of man is the most quietly dangerous force in the room. Every man is born into an architecture of affirmation. Before he speaks his first conviction, he's rewarded for mimicry. Before he questions anything, he's taught what approval feels like and how easily it's withdrawn. The structure is quiet but absolute. Signal what others reward, suppress what others resist, and you will be safe. But that safety has a cost. The culture that raises him teaches him to look outward for confirmation, not just for identity, but for emotional permission. Is this acceptable? Is this enough? Am I enough? It shows up everywhere, in advertising where products aren't sold for utility, but for emotional repair. In digital life where feedback loops become the measure of self-worth. In relationships where vulnerability is often traded not for connection, but control. The message is consistent. Your peace is external. Your worth is conditional. Your value is reflected. This is not dysfunction. This is design. Because a man who depends on validation is a man in motion. He moves toward praise. He adjusts to avoid rejection. He performs not because he's vain, but because he's been told that performance is the only way to be loved. And when you live that way long enough, dependence stops feeling like submission. It starts feeling like identity. But there's a quiet violence under the surface, because the more a man needs to be seen to feel real, the more manipulable he becomes. Every disapproval becomes a threat. Every silence becomes a trigger. Every withdrawal of attention feels like a withdrawal of self. That fragility isn't personal, it's systemic. It keeps economies moving, platforms addictive, hierarchies intact. Men who are emotionally self-reliant don't make ideal consumers. They don't chase trends. They don't broadcast insecurity dressed as ambition. They don't flinch, which means they're harder to guide by marketing, by ideology, by social pressure. That makes them dangerous, not because they disrupt with force, but because they disrupt by not participating. And when a man no longer plays by the rules of emotional dependency, the system doesn't know what to do with him. It can't reward him. It can't punish him. It can't read him. He becomes illegible. And in a world addicted to emotional transaction, the man who no longer trades is the one thing it can't absorb. Solitude isn't the absence of others. It's the removal of response. No one affirming you, no one reflecting you, no one reacting to you. And without those mirrors, something disorienting happens. You stop playing a role, and what's left behind doesn't arrive fully formed. It arrives raw. At first, solitude feels like stillness, but it's not. It's exposure. Exposure to every hunger you thought you'd buried, every belief you never questioned, every feeling that only made sense in the presence of someone else. Most people never get that far. They treat solitude like a detox, brief, tolerable, performative, a weekend without their phone, a quiet walk with a playlist, a vacation disguised as escape. But true solitude, the kind that reforms a man, isn't peaceful. It's confrontational. Because the first thing you meet in silence is your need to escape it. That's when it begins. The looped memories, the rehearsed conversations, the surge of self-judgment without an audience to soften it. You start to realize how much of your identity was built to be seen. The way you speak, the way you hold your body, the values you emphasize depending on who's in the room. None of it was dishonest. but much of it was reactive. Solitude interrupts that reactivity, not because it gives you better answers, but because it removes the performance long enough for real questions to surface. Why do I want what I want? Who benefits from my self-image? What part of me only exists because someone else expected it? This isn't reflection, it's excavation. And that's the shift, because once you've sat in solitude long enough to stop editing what arises, once you stop narrating yourself to yourself, you start seeing what you've actually become. Not who you intended to be, not who others said you were, but what you are when no one's watching and nothing's performing. That's not a peaceful discovery, but it's a clean one. And from that clarity, something else begins to take shape, not just an identity free of influence, but a mind no longer designed around reception. A man who has confronted himself long enough no longer needs to be understood. He becomes the rarest thing in modern life, a man who doesn't flinch in the absence of feedback. There are only two things a man can do once he stops performing. He can begin to discipline what remains, or he can begin to destroy it. Marcus Aurelius and Friedrich Nietzsche arrived at the same psychological border, then took opposite paths through it. For Marcus, solitude became structure. Each night he turned inward, not to reflect but to examine. He didn't seek peace, he sought alignment. What did I pursue today that I didn't need? Where did I act from fear instead of clarity? What part of me still craves reward? These weren't rhetorical questions, they were interrogations. He was stripping away the ornamental self, the one built for command, for image, for stature, the part of him Rome had inflated. In solitude, he wasn't emperor. He was the only man who could not lie to himself. Nietzsche chose a different solitude, one that didn't refine the inherited self, but burned it down. Where Marcus sought discipline, Nietzsche demanded rupture. He wasn't asking how to live within the world's structure. He was asking why it existed at all, and more importantly, why we obey it. Morality, belief, identity, he treated them not as truths to align with, but as systems to dismantle. Inherited values were not sacred, they were suspicious. Tradition wasn't wisdom, it was repetition. This wasn't contrarianism, it was authorship. Because when a man enters true solitude, he discovers that most of what he's lived by was never chosen. He didn't build his ethics. He didn't define his masculinity. He didn't create his God. He accepted them. Both Marcus and Nietzsche began their confrontation in isolation. But what they found on the other side wasn't the same. One built internal order, the other destroyed external permission. Together, they reveal the two fates of a man who exits social dependence. He either becomes sovereign through discipline or dangerous through self-creation. And in both cases, he can no longer be managed. Not by praise, not by shame, not by ideology. Because once a man realizes that everything he was taught to fear, rejection, doubt, exclusion, can be endured in solitude, he stops negotiating his identity to avoid it. He doesn't need permission to think. He doesn't need agreement to act. He becomes the one thing modern culture cannot domesticate. A man who defines his values without needing them, echoed. Solitude doesn't gift you qualities. It removes the scaffolding that kept them hidden. What emerges isn't power in the conventional sense, it's neutrality. A man no longer emotionally engineered by the room he's in. Not cold, not arrogant, just unreadable to those who expect performance. Because what you see in him isn't effort, it's the absence of need. There are patterns to this. Not signals he broadcasts, but patterns he no longer participates in. Not traits he cultivates, but dependencies he dissolves. Radical self-honesty. He doesn't lie to himself to preserve comfort. He doesn't soften his failures or exaggerate his strengths. Not because he's virtuous, but because illusion is noisy, and he no longer has the appetite to maintain it. This honesty is dangerous because it doesn't end with him. It makes him a quiet detector of falsehood in others, flattery, guilt, performance. He sees it without judgment, but he doesn't play along. Value independence. He no longer asks what's expected of him. He asks what aligns with what he's seen, what he's lived, what he can stand behind. That often looks like integrity, but it's not a code, it's a spine. There's no external authority he's trying to conform to or rebel against. So he can't be baited by shame, and he won't be coerced by praise. Emotional sovereignty. He regulates from within. He knows what sadness is without spiraling. He knows what anger is without broadcasting it. He knows what joy is without needing others to witness it. He still feels everything. He's just no longer obligated to react. Intellectual courage. He thinks beyond the allowable, not recklessly, not to provoke, but because once you've lived outside the need for agreement, truth becomes more important than belonging. He'll follow an idea into discomfort, not because he wants to suffer, but because he's lost the instinct to self-censor just to keep the peace. None of these traits are adopted. They're what remain when external orientation falls away. He didn't memorize them. He earned them in silence. And that silence rewired something far more threatening than behavior. It rewired how he makes decisions. Not to be accepted, not to be praised, but to stay in alignment with a man no one else created. There's a price for internal freedom, not imposed, not inflicted, but inevitable. Because the moment a man stops depending on others to regulate who he is, he no longer fits the mold they use to shape him. Relationships begin to shift, not with conflict, but with erosion. Interactions feel thinner, conversations drag, expectations go unmet, not because he's resisting, but because he's no longer performing. People say he's distant, hard to reach, closed off, but he's not closed. He's just no longer broadcasting. And in a world where most connection is signal-based, posture, vulnerability, validation, his silence becomes unreadable. It's not hostility, it's just clarity. Clarity that he won't inflate discomfort to make others feel useful. Clarity that he won't dilute conviction to make others feel safe. Clarity that he no longer needs to be softened to be accepted. That kind of man is disorienting because he stops playing the game others didn't know they were playing. And without the old neediness to anchor them, some will drift. Certain friendships collapse quietly, not through betrayal, through asymmetry. He no longer needs what the friendship was built around: reassurance, distraction, identity mirroring. So the connection frays, not maliciously, just mechanically. Some family ties begin to feel conditional, not out of malice, but because he no longer seeks affirmation in the roles they gave him. The dutiful son, the promising one, the version they were proud of. Now they can't read him, so they pathologize his calm. They mistake distance for disdain. They call it a phase, or worse, an illness. But what they're reacting to isn't rejection, it's independence. And independence, when you've been bonded by emotional debt, always feels like betrayal. Even new connections become rare, not because he's inaccessible, but because few people know how to relate without transaction. They want resonance. He offers presence. They want engagement. He offers silence. They want to be needed. He isn't. And so he becomes, in their eyes, emotionally unavailable. But that's not quite right. He's available, just not adjustable. He doesn't shift to be liked. He doesn't emote to be safe. He doesn't mirror to maintain peace. That kind of man is seen at best as powerful, at worst as dangerous. Because when someone no longer needs your approval, you lose your ability to manage them. And most relationships, even the kind ones, are built on mutual manageability. The self-authored man doesn't fight the system. He makes it irrelevant, not through rebellion, through refusal, because every major structure that governs modern life economy, culture, media, even politics functions on a single premise: that people can be influenced if you touch the right insecurity. And insecurity only survives through dependency. If you don't need to prove anything, they can't sell you improvement. If you don't need to belong, they can't leverage your isolation. If you don't need to be right, they can't bait you into tribal warfare. Need is the fulcrum of control, and the man who dissolves it breaks leverage at the root. He no longer buys status, and he doesn't react to shame. He doesn't seek distraction. He isn't polarized by narrative. He doesn't need to believe what the group believes just to feel safe. He doesn't need to participate in outrage just to feel powerful. And when that man appears, he begins to unmask the machine. Others notice, not because he's loud, but because he's still. He doesn't flinch in conversation. He doesn't reach in silence. He doesn't validate their opinions just to preserve rapport. That kind of presence reveals the imbalance. Because if one man can feel whole without performance, what does that say about a culture built entirely around performance? Now the crisis begins. Economically, he's a poor consumer. He doesn't chase identity through objects, and he doesn't outsource meaning to luxury or affirmation. Politically, he's difficult to provoke, and he doesn't vote from fear. He doesn't identify through sides. He doesn't require an enemy to feel conviction. Socially, he's unclassifiable. He doesn't signal status. He doesn't obey emotional cues. He doesn't affirm what he doesn't believe, just to be included. And psychologically, he breaks the mirror because he reminds others without intention that their identity is still built on reception, that their values are still inherited, that their peace is still conditional. He isn't antagonistic, but his presence is incompatible with illusion. And illusions, to survive, require constant affirmation. So when he doesn't play along, he becomes the thing society was designed to suppress. A man who sees clearly and still doesn't return to the group. Something strange happens when a man stops needing others. At first, people pull away. Then, slowly, they start to orbit. Not because he became more charming, not because he marketed strength, but because detachment exposes need, and the presence of someone who doesn't need you makes you confront why you needed to be needed in the first place. This is the inversion. The man who was once accused of being distant, difficult, or dangerous becomes the one people quietly watch for cues. Not performative cues, existential ones. He doesn't lead through charisma. He doesn't gather through persuasion. He doesn't comfort through agreement. But people feel the calm, and it disorients them. Because most people live in a state of low-grade psychological hunger. Hunger for attention, for reassurance, for reflected identity. And standing near someone who no longer participates in that economy doesn't feel safe, it feels clean. And that clarity has a gravity. They don't know why they're drawn to him, but they are. Because he doesn't react when challenged. He doesn't cling when excluded. He doesn't panic when misunderstood. His neutrality is magnetic because it's not indifferent, it's unleveraged. But here's the irony. He didn't cultivate this presence to become more attractive. He didn't build these traits to gain influence. He didn't renounce the crowd to gain admiration. He stopped needing, and everything else reoriented around it. Now the very thing that made him illegible, the absence of signaling, becomes the trait others misinterpret as confidence, as discipline, as mystery. It's none of those. It's authorship. A man who no longer needs others to affirm his identity becomes the one thing others can't look away from. Evidence that freedom is possible, and most people quietly chose safety instead. So they gather near him, some with curiosity, some with projection, some with resentment. But the man doesn't gather them. He doesn't resist them either. He just continues as he was, unshaped by attention, untethered by approval, and uninterested in the theater of being understood. And in that silence, the whole structure of dependency begins to crack, not because he fought it, but because he made it unnecessary. What you learn in solitude isn't how to escape people. It's how often you were adjusting yourself to avoid losing them. You begin to see it clearly, how approval shaped your tone, how fear edited your opinions, how need made you easier to keep in place. And when that need disappears, something else goes quiet too. You stop performing your identity. You stop chasing emotional cues. You stop offering a signal that says, I can still be influenced. That's when the environment shifts. Not because you became a threat, but because you stopped being useful. So here's the question. If society depends on your need, what happens when you no longer need anyone?